Hello and welcome. My name is Carol Carter, and I'm the founder and CEO of Global Minded. And we meet here once a month with Dr. Ryan Ross and have the series called Get Comfortable Being Uncomfortable. Ryan has incredible sessions every single month, and he runs diversity, equity, and inclusion for the Community College of Colorado system, but he's also involved in a lot of other national leadership initiatives, including being one of Global Minded's key leaders. So we're delighted that he's here today. And I want to share with our topic and our guest today that we're really honoring that this is Native American month and that we want to honor Native American people every day of the year and all the time. And I brought my my talking stick so that I can metaphorically pass that on to Ryan, who can pass it on to each of you. So thank you so very much. Very honored to have you all here, and really looking forward to learning from you and having you in our sacred circle of what is the Global Minded community. So thank you again so much for being here. Ryan?
All righty. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another month. As Carol said, I'm excited to be with you. And as always, thank you guys for tuning in. As you know, we only have an hour, excuse me, we only have an hour, so we're going to jump right in. But before we introduce our panel, we're just going to take a quick moment. And if I could just have you follow me for a quick second as we do a land acknowledgement for the virtual space that we're in. So as we gather in this virtual space, we recognize that we are connected with one another through the winds that bow air into our lungs and through the waters that move deep into the earth and up into the sky. We acknowledge that the ground beneath our feet is historically the home of Indigenous peoples, many of whom who have been forced to leave for other lands. We share and we honor all of the peoples who were first to live, celebrate, lament, and sing upon the land that we now sit upon. And so if you know the lands that you sit upon and you want to honor those, if you would just list those in the chat. But I just want to thank you for that. And we are going to jump right into our panel. As you know, we talk about getting comfortable, being uncomfortable, and we talk about many aspects of equity. But I think that there is one, just for me personally, there's just one issue as an educator that I feel like always gets left out, always gets skimmed over. They're half truths told, and that's the experience of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. So I'm excited to engage in what will be a brief conversation. And full disclosure, you're not going to get closure when we leave this conversation, right? You're gonna leave with questions and comments, concerns, and a desire, hopefully, to learn more and to do more and to show up more for our brothers and sisters. And so with that being said, I just want to thank Dr. Cheryl Crazy Bull, Jamison Lopez, and Jasmine Neosh. Is it Neosh? Did I say that right, Jasmine?
Very close. It's Neosh, but you're Neosh, in the ballpark.
I'm sorry about that. I want to get that right. But and Jasmine, Neosh for being with us today. We're going to have them introduce themselves. And Jasmine, since you're up, why don't we have you introduce yourself?
Thank you so much. Poso Mawanawiak. Hello, everyone. My name is Jasmine Neosh. I'm a student at the College of Menominee Nation, working towards my bachelor's degree in public administration. I also have an associate degree from natural resources, or associate degree in natural resources from the same college. I'm currently calling in from the ancestral homeland of me. I'm just south of the reservation borders in north central Wisconsin, the land of the Menominee. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being with us, Jameson.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Kutzgalum. My name is Jamison Lopez. I'm from the Quetzal Nation, Fort Yuma, California. I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona as an urban native. Currently in Tucson, Arizona. I serve as a faculty member at the University of Arizona right now. So it's great to be here.
Thank you so much. I wish I was in Arizona right now. It's about to get cold in Colorado. And Dr. Crazy Bull.
Tatu ashtemi dakiapi, wachiapi wi imachiapi, then Shachanga Lakota Imataha, then Itancha American Indian College Fund, Chante Washte Nape Chayus Api. Greetings, good day, relatives. Cheryl Crazy Bull, President and CEO of the American Indian College Fund. I'm a Shechanga Lakota, originally from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, currently living in the homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute peoples outside of the Hiska, or the White Mountains, otherwise known as the Rockies. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you again, all of you, for joining me today. And my first question, and as always on these panels, everybody can respond to anything. We just love a conversation flow. But the first question, I'm going to target you, Dr. Crazy Bull. And you know, many people would argue, and I'm one of them, that, as I mentioned earlier, so one of our greatest injustices to date is the treatment and displacement of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. But it seems to be the least discussed inequity. And from your perspective, what are some of these injustices? From a visibility perspective in higher ed? And then as a follow-up, what do you think the conversation about what happened to Native peoples and visibility, why isn't it as loud as it should be on a national level in general?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. So I'm going to answer that second part first. I think that our story is not told because it's really a story of genocide and removal. So if you look at the history of European contact with Indigenous peoples in this hemisphere, you'll see that it is very deeply rooted in a desire to gain access to resources, which from that perspective is, you know, the land and the water and whatever is contained with that, including animals and plants and all of that. And so just examining that history is very challenging. People, you know, it is something that we as human beings, I think often we want to deny that kind of experience. We want to look away from it and pretend that it didn't really happen like that, that it was in fact, you know, a war or Indians fought back or, you know, something happened that allows that to not be fully seen. And I think because it is so hard to fully see that, then we experience all the inequities that you know, underpin this whole issue of visibility. So when I think about the inequities, I think about that we have as human beings inherent rights, and those inherent rights to live in healthy families and communities, you know, through access to all the resources that you need to have that. So I often think of, you know, the experiences that our ancestors had really kind of leading up to this point where we don't have access and we aren't seen, because to do that means that you have to make reparations and remedy, you know, the injustices that occurred. So when I, just to be a little bit more specific, you know, just even access to education, access to healthcare, employment, kind of modern day experiences. You know, it's hard to get access to those kinds of things if people can't see that you're there experiencing that, because it's so painful, and to examine that history and to look at ways that you can make reparations of that. I think about visibility in higher education being particularly related to creating those safe and welcoming environments that students then can experience higher education in a positive way. I think that, you know, that's hard to get access to because it means making what might be viewed by people as an inequitable investment in order to restore people to, you know, to equity and to that kind of experience. And I think the last thing I'll share is that representation for me is when you see us in elected office, when you see us in employment, when you see us in the power structures that occur throughout the country, that's us adapting to modern society, because we might view from a traditional perspective as equity being our right to access our traditional knowledge, our languages, our ways of knowing. So it's complex, but But I do think it is about, looking and kind of owning the truth.
Thank you. Jameson or Jasmine, anything to add there?
Yeah, there is a really wonderful piece of wisdom that was given to me recently by one of my non-native instructors that just really, I think, like got to the core of what you're asking here, which is that until the lion learns to write and speak, the story of its life will always be told from the perspective of the hunter. And I think that's really kind of like what's going on here is that, until we're able to get the power that we need to like tell our own stories, which has historically been flat out denied to us, our true story will never really be told. And so now that's kind of like what we're seeing, and we're seeing how powerful it is as more Indigenous people become educated and find their voice and then find the bravery to speak up on it. That's why things are changing now, and I'm really excited for it. But it's definitely something that needed to be overcome.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Dr. Ross. I think one of the things that really sticks out to me, just talking about visibility of Native folks and the injustices that exist in the world, there's so many to name, and I appreciate Dr. Crazy Bull like kind of addressing some of like the broader ones, but when we get even more narrow into higher education, or I would first start with stereotypes. We're not all alcoholics. We pay taxes. I pay property tax. I pay sales tax. I pay, taxes, on just about everything in my life. We don't go to college for free, which is a big deal. And I think just starting with those have been like very, I feel like for the Indigenous community as a whole, in a way that there's been a controlled narrative about our communities, not by us. And, I think going back to that alcohol idea, there was something written by Dr. Cunningham at the University of Arizona in 2016. He did an analysis looking at a national data set and really thinking about that question, like, everybody says natives are alcoholics, but relative to what? And as he looked through the history and researched it, he looked through it and he's like, there's nothing, like, it's not based in any empirical evidence. And so he conducted a study, and what he found was that actually natives drink less when it comes to not, being, abstinent from drinking. If they're drinking low to moderate, we drink less. On heavy and binge drinking, we were equal to about white folks. And so when you think about that, you're like, so this whole time, my whole life, probably people before me, we all thought we were alcoholics. We've seen in John Wayne movies, McClintock, where's the whiskey? You hear all these things that have been like pounded into our heads, not just like mainstream media, mainstream folks and households, but even within our own Native community, of what's been told about us. And, taking the time to stop and think is like, well, what is this based in? Where's the evidence of this? Do I have any actual physical evidence that this exists in the world? And, a lot of that came through the media in the 1800s when they were trying to do like, land grab and, kind of taking the lands, as Dr. Crazy Bull was saying. And, they were trying to portray Native people as like incompetent alcoholics, not being able to take care of themselves. And so it was an easier way to just be able to take advantage of a lot of the Indigenous communities. And that's really where a lot of those kind of stereotypes begin to take root. And it's just really unfortunate because I think that continues to this day. And when we think about college, it's like, oh, natives go to college for free. I'm like, I don't know. I didn't go to college for free. I paid for college. Any help I got was because of my tribe, but it's from my tribal economic development. And so that's them sharing their capital gains from our community that we earned, not necessarily that we got from the federal government. And so it's like, it's the same as getting these scholarships. And so I think that's just a few of the stereotypes that I think really stick out in my mind when I think about, the invisibility of Native people and people's understanding of just our communities as a whole. And, when you really talk about data as well, it's non-existent in the world. And I mean, we could talk a little bit about that later, but I think those are just my initial thoughts to your question.
Yeah, thank you. And and narrative is so powerful, and the word history is interesting, right? Because it's his story when you break it down, right? And so it's the perspective of one person, and I struggle with that a lot as it relates to the experiences of underrepresented folks in general. But as we're looking at with regard to including Native history and culture in the classrooms, right? How would this historical account differ if it was told from the perspective of the Indigenous community? What? How would that differ from what we currently see or what's currently offered in classrooms in society at large?
I'll just share a couple of things in that regard, and then perhaps my other colleagues would have more to share. But the having a curriculum that is based in developing human beings is that's the foundation of Indigenous education. In Indigenous education, we want our children to be good human beings, to live in relationship to the rest of creation, to understand that stewardship and that reciprocity are inherent in our living as good human beings. And so I think that it would benefit all peoples to have a curriculum that is inclusive of that kind of an understanding, rather than an understanding that we as human beings dominate creation, that we as human beings are, I think for years, we as Native educators have viewed that it's not our goal to raise our children for their job. That's not our goal. Our goal is that our children be raised so that they can provide for their families and provide for their community. And providing is being able to live well on the land and to use the foods and resources that are available to you, to trade with others, to be a productive person. So I think curriculum can be modified in lots of different ways then from that context, because you're looking at, just really changing the approach and the thinking behind what curriculum looks like. But from a kind of governance perspective, I think it's real important that curriculum just not make Native peoples invisible. And I use examples of even in higher education. Do we, in your American government class, there are tribal governments included, right? If you look, just yesterday, the White House issued a directive that they were going to now include Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in their scientific decision-making and policy, and they included the impact of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in spiritual systems. So just that whole kind of approach to being a human being, I think, is how curriculum can really be changed. Maybe Dr. Lopez.
Other thoughts there?
No, you go. I went first last night. You go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I don't mind. So when I think about curriculum, in 1928, there was a report that came out called the Merriam Report. It kind of gave a broad overview of Native country in the 20s. And it went over health data, economic data, and in there was also an education section. It's a big 400-page document. And in the education section, they were advocating for having highly qualified teachers. They were advocating for not having standardized testing. They were advocating for culturally relevant education, not in those words, but they were describing it. And when you think about all of that in 1928, they were talking about this. They were saying we couldn't do the same standardized testing and measuring these Native kids against it because the test was biased. You know, it was asking a question about boats. You know, if the boat leaves at, 4 p.m. and arrives at 6 p.m., how many hours pass? And all these Native kids were like, what the heck's a boat? I've never seen a boat before. This is the 20s. And you fast forward to 2018, and they have the Broken Promises report, which is almost the same exact recommendations: culturally relevant education, highly qualified teachers. We can't measure these students in the same standardized testing. And it's just like frustrating that you're like, 90 years later, essentially, you're like, what has really, really changed? Like, what recommendations have really been taken up by, the federal government, state governments, whoever it may be, to really advocate for Indigenous people? You always see, I'm on the National Indian Ed Study, and it looks at, the educational progress of 4th and 8th grade students. And there's always like this gap, like, they call it the achievement gap in reading and math. And when you look at the trend, it doesn't seem like it's changed much over the last couple of decades. And you're like, at what point will we realize, like, hey, maybe we should measure our Native kids against some other different type of metric? And I really appreciate that Dr. Crazy Bull brings that up, because I think in higher education, it's the same way. We all know about accreditation, I think. And, if you ever gone to Higher Learning Commission, my dad was a college administrator for a long time. He would stress about going to Chicago and going to see North Central accrediting every 5 years, usually, because they were on the 5-year plan. And he would get up there and he would advocate. He had always had the retention rate, persistence rates, enrollment, GPAs, graduation rates. And I'm like, are those really the educational outcomes we should be measuring our Native students against? There's a book by Django Paris and Aline. It's called Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies. And in there's a line that says, the outcomes we measure, the educational outcomes we measure should be based on the values of the community. And I really hold on to that line, because I'm like, the community values, that's what we should be measuring. When you go to the Native community, it's going to be different between Native communities. But I think Dr. Crazybull mentioned something that kind of goes beyond most, that's kind of pan-Native, if you will, where it's like, will we give back to the community? Almost every Native college student I know wants to give back to their community. And you don't have to go to college to do that. When I go to my community and I ask them, like, what is it that you want to see from a successful college student? We say, we want to see them give back. What are they giving back? How are they contributing to our nation? And I'm like, man, that should be the outcome we're measuring, how we're measuring giving back, how we're measuring nation building. And that might look a little bit different in every community. But I think that value is there of what we should be measuring that's not measured, that continuously keeps us at an achievement gap when we look at the data. So,
thank you for that. It's interesting. I sometimes I think about fear, right? Like in the majority culture, are folks so afraid of what the truth reveals that we'll never be able to move forward or be innovative enough in education to really create opportunities for all of our students to thrive, right? Like we've got to get over this fear piece. We've got to respect the cultural narratives and experiences of people. And there's just so much more to learn when we can pull everybody's collective experiences. And you'd think that something so simple, something that, in my opinion, is common sense, that we do that, right? But we don't. And as Jameson, as a researcher, you see, looking at the data and doing what you do on a daily basis, you see the inequity or the lack of representation of Native people in the data in higher education. Can you talk a little bit about why the inequity exists, or why that conversation is missing?
Sure. I don't mind jumping into it. I just want to make sure, Jasmine, do you have anything you wanted to add to the last part?
Oh, no, I was kind of mesmerized where you went with that. So I'm good to go. Thank you, though.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that, Dr. Austin. Thank you, Jasmine.
Oh, no, you're good. No, I appreciate that, because like to Jasmine's point, I was like, man, that was just so rich. I wanted you to dive deeper. So I'm like, let's talk about this data.
Yeah, no, for me, the data, when we look at it, it's interesting because even when we have national data sets, right? And we look across the spectrum of the United States and we want to say this is representative of Native country. In reality, it isn't. I'm going to mess it up, but there's probably over 570 federally recognized tribes, another 60 more state recognized tribes, and other tribes seeking, recognition from either state or federal. And when you look at the national data sets, they don't collect data that way. If we were to take a very basic statistical concept of survey research, which is, simple random sampling where everybody has the equal probability of being selected into the data of one, it's like, it's going to be mostly probably about Navajos and Cherokees, and it's not a slight against them. It's just they're the largest tribes probably in the US. Maybe Sioux would be up there too. But, it wouldn't be a study about my tribe, that's only 4,000 members, or another tribe that's across the river that's 1,000. We would most likely be excluded from that study. And so therefore, it's more of a study about larger tribes. And what that does in my mind is it diminishes the sovereignty of those individual nations of saying, we're going to make policies based on these 3 to 10 tribes and forget about everybody else. And in a way, I feel like that diminishes the sovereignty of these individual nations of saying like, well, what is it that they're bringing to the table? Maybe there's a different political agenda. Maybe, where's their voice in all of this? Because it's being completely excluded. I think a lot of it has to do too. We know there's this asterisk phenomena that we see in a lot of the data, where they have a little asterisk at the bottom. They say like statistically insignificant, there's bias estimates and so forth. You see all kinds of, you can look at any federal data report and it'll have some kind of conclusion like that. That's partly due to ethnic fraud because people are marking, especially in colleges, marking that they're Native to try to get scholarship money because they do think we go to school for free. Part of it, you could see that with folks trying to get jobs, and we could see that as diversity hires, diversity enrollment, whatever it may be. You see those things marked, and it's really tragic because then it does really create bias estimates. And another reason we can't find statistical significance in a lot of this national data is just because they're not asking good questions. These variables and question items, they're totally irrelevant to Indigenous communities. Like you're like, if you looked at some of them and you're like, there's no questions about family and the influence on persistence. Family is the core concept of what helps Native students get through college. And you're not controlling for that or measuring that in any type of significant way. So of course your results are going to be inconclusive or not non-statistically significant for that matter. And so for me, I think a lot of it is there has been some kind of idea of trying to put Natives into a monolith of saying like, hey, we're all the same, without recognizing like we're all individual nations and we all want to want our voice represented. And so for me, I advocate for something more like Indigenous data collection, where you get a large enough sample, you expand the sampling frame so you do reach enough statistical power by collecting data by creation story, as opposed to state or county level, which is another kind of colonial construct placed onto Indigenous people. But if you're collecting it by, say, creation story, I could think of my own, and we have Quetzan, Cocopah, Mojave, Chemehueve, and so forth. And we could go down that river and we all have a similar language. We all have similar culture. We sing bird songs. We have a similar cremation ceremony. And so then you could really measure things that are important to the communities. Like culture is a difficult construct to measure, but when you have a likeness in that, then there's a possibility there. When you could ask questions, and then you could ask like, okay, how does this cultural experience influence college outcomes, or you're willing to give back, or GPA, or graduation rates? And I would even flip the statistical models and say, like I said earlier, the outcomes need to be based on the values of the community. I would say, maybe we shouldn't be seeing how culture and giving back and family support influences graduation rates, but maybe we should see how graduation rates influence giving back to the community. Because I think that's where we really start privileging community voices, when we flip the model on its head a little bit. and we say, this is the outcome we're actually really interested in. And for me, like looking through the data, there's so much more to go into that with identity, and the identity across Indian country being different, you know, some being enrolled through blood quantum, some being descendancy, some, you know, being a quarter and not a, you know, eighth, and, you know, being disenrolled. There's so many, and it's all dependent on the tribes. And so I think that's why the context really needs to be narrowed down just a little bit when we're looking at the data itself. And then there does need to be more kind of nuances at the national level and the federal data level of saying like, okay, how can we break this up in a more meaningful way? So.
Thank you. Dr. Crazy Bull or Jasmine, anything to add here?
No, I'm just totally impressed. So I'm like feeling that great, you know, pride that in our scholars. They're just so wonderful. And I think that if I added anything, it's that we do have a lot of amazing Native scholarship, and, you know, that's represented by the people here on this panel. So we have the resources that can inform public policy, can inform curriculum, you know, can inform investment. And that's an important takeaway, I think, for people, is it doesn't have to come from outside the community. The community has it available to be shared and benefited from.
Thank you. And Jameson, you talked about smaller tribes, and Jasmine, I know that you're from a smaller tribe that may or may not be known to many folks. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to share some about your tribe, and then also kind of talk about your experience being a student in a mainstream college as well as a tribal college. You know, like what were the differences? What were some of the experiences that made you feel visible as a Native student in the tribal college experience? And how is that similar, you know, or how is that different to the experience that you had at a mainstream institution?
Sure. So I am a non-traditional student at College of Menominee Nation right now. I'm actually 32. Don't be surprised by the youthful skin. But I did attend 2 non-tribal colleges before this, one of which was, you know, I was 17. I was captured by the idea of like a big, illustrious, private liberal arts university with like a fancy saying on its masthead and all that stuff. So like that was kind of what drew me to that. And I did very well. You know, I found the coursework very stimulating. I found the instructors to be passionate about what they did, and that, you know, did translate to the classroom. But there was something about that. And I was a history and journalism major at the time with a minor in new media studies. Something about that just wasn't clicking. And to be honest, I didn't understand what it was, because I was really passionate about writing. I was really passionate about history. And yet, despite the fact that this was an objectively good university, there was something there that just didn't quite make me feel at home. When I transferred to my second school, which was a private arts college in Chicago, I kind of figured like, okay, maybe it was just a mismatch of interests. You know, obviously, like I wanted to be an artist. I'm meant to be an artist. That's why, you know, it wasn't working out for me at this like fancy 4-year university. And at first it was fine. You know, it was kind of interesting being the only Indigenous person in my program, possibly in my school, because I got, you know, a lot of attention for that at a time when I was going through some pretty serious Indigenous identity issues of my own. And that worked for a little while, but then after some time, it just didn't fit anymore. It actually got to the point where I was kind of feeling what a lot of Native students feel, which is that, you know, maybe higher education just isn't for me. I tried 2 really good schools at things that I loved, and for some reason, there's just not a home for me there. Which, you know, like looking back on it is really, really foolish. And I didn't like, it took me a while to get to the answer that I needed. So when I got to College of Menominee Nation, I'll fully admit I didn't go because it was a tribal college. I went because I wanted to contribute something positive to the environmental crisis. And I knew that that needed to be law and policy. And I knew that because of the way that I learned things, if I'm going to come at this big issue, I need to find a way to see what it looks like when it's successful. So being the fact that my tribe is, even though we are smaller, we're like world renowned in terms of like the sustainability world, because of what we've done with our forests. It's just so amazing. It's like one of the best case studies that I can imagine in terms of like positive sustainability examples from a law and policy perspective. But that's kind of like where I found out exactly what the problem is. When we talk about things like settler colonialism, we kind of just talk about it in this big abstraction, right? Like it's bad for all these XYZ reasons, displacement and everything else. But I think what settler colonialism does, not just for Native students, but literally for everyone, is it robs us of context. A lot of the things that Jameson is discussing is really about that. It's, you know, if you're asking questions without having the proper context for why you're asking those questions, of course, you're not going to get the data that actually shows you what you need to know, because you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know enough to know that you don't know it. So that's really what College of Menominee did for me, is they gave me the space to find that context. They gave me people who had already gone through and like figured that out for themselves, and could actually show me what it looks like to be not just a successful person in a Western world as an Indigenous person, but how can I be fully Indigenous, unapologetically Indigenous, and fully in my own skin without having to sacrifice success in that world. And I think like that very rambling question, answer to your question, I think is kind of, yeah, that's really what it is. It showed me what it's like to be a Native person and a successful Native person in a way that I just really could not have done at a mainstream university.
Right, and just speaking to, you know, the institution that you're at, being world renowned for for the Sustainable Forestry Program and the Sustainability Institute. Can you talk a little bit about some of your work experiences and why environmental justice is so important to you and for many Indigenous, especially members of your tribe?
Absolutely. So I made the decision to come back to college during Standing Rock. Specifically, there's like a whole sad sob story here too, where it was basically just like realizing my limited capacity as an individual to contribute meaningfully to something that mattered so much to me. To the broader question of why Indigenous people, you know, find themselves so attracted to environmental issues, is because that's like literally who we are. And I find it difficult to, for a long time, like found a difficult way to like understand that in myself. But as of late, because of College of Menominee, it's really sort of started to come together, where like for thousands and thousands of years, our literal survival, that context that I talked about for how we understand the world, like a lot of that came from having to live with it, and not just like live on it, but live with it as a relative, and all those things that come through being successful in a place for thousands of years. That was like the context that sort of allowed it. And that's a context that continues today, where, you know, the reason why Indigenous people are so caught up in environmental issues is because like, it's not just theoretical for us. It's literally life and death, where like, if we find ourselves without clean drinking water, what are you going to do? My work at the Sustainable Development Institute has really gone a long way towards showing me how all encompassing that can be, and how much it really does affect every aspect of our lives, where I've done things like database building, like GIS work, and then all the way down to finding ways to incorporate traditional Menominee ecological knowledge into food sovereignty programs, and looking at that in the context of climate change. So there's like super interesting work that's going on there, but it's also super relevant work that, you know, there's some fantastic research opportunities at non-tribal colleges, but I don't think that ability to find things that are culturally relevant to us that also have implications for the rest of the world at a tiny little college in the middle of the Midwest, that is like super, super exciting. I can't say enough about that.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit, and Cheryl, I want to come back to you as the CEO of the American Indian College Fund. I learned a little bit about a national visibility campaign that you guys are looking at called "This Is Indian Country," and you know, as I understand it, it really came from responses very similar to what Jasmine just shared about feeling invisible in higher education. And so just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the College Fund, what you guys do, and then what you guys hope to achieve with this campaign, and definitely share how people can engage or support, so we can support our Indigenous students inside and outside of higher ed.
Sure, thanks. Actually, I think both Jameson and Jasmine's comments up to now have really laid the foundation for This is Indian Country. You know, the purpose of that, the College Fund has been a successful advocate for increased support of Native students and of tribal colleges and universities, partly by constantly telling a story of the just really amazing students and communities that we work with. And so over the years, through a successful partnership, a really wonderful partnership with Wyden and Kennedy, we've been able to tell the story in various ways. Our Indian campaign, have you seen a real Indian? Just different kinds of ways of constantly sharing with the public in American society that, we're here. And a few years ago, the College Fund through myself was involved with Reclaiming Native Truth, which was a national research project that looked at American viewpoints about Indigenous people. And that project did, research from multiple angles, looking at general population, but looking at specific groups like Congress, or also looking to the impact of mascots and things like that. So there was this huge body of knowledge. And then a number of organizations just kind of became more involved in looking at Indigenous people and creating opportunities and venues for that to happen. So we were always hearing, of course, just as my other panelists have shared, we're always hearing that we're not seen. And so our very creative media partners came up with the idea that a This is Indian Country campaign would be a very provocative way to engage the general population. That if you see something that an image that flies over Manhattan and talks about it being Manhattan, or flies over Mount Rushmore and talks about Indigenous people being the founders of democracy, it's got to provoke you to go want to learn more. And so we saw this as a pathway or an entry point by which anyone, whether you're, a student or an academic or a parent or a legislator, or just, the guy sitting in the coffee shop down the street, you see that and you think, why? What do they mean by that? You go to the thisisindiancountry.com, which I see one of my team members posted in the chat. The link to that. Tons of resources that will educate you about Indian country, educate you about important issues, the history of Indian people's contributions to this country, give you links to different books, movies, TV shows, other ways of representation. So that's our intention, is to draw attention to Indigenous peoples. And then through that, of course, we're always seeking support so that we can provide the opportunity for more students like Jasmine, or work with more scholars like Jameson, to have a successful college experience and to share more knowledge about us. So you can go to thisisindiancountry.com, or you can go to the College Fund website and, learn a lot and also support our work.
Yeah. And so speaking of support and accessing information, we've got 90 or so folks with us today. Primarily, most, I think, are higher education professionals. And I just wanted to get your thoughts. you know, as a former TCU president and now in your current role at the American Indian College Fund, you know, what do you suggest that higher educational professionals be thinking about or doing in their daily work to create welcoming, more inclusive campus cultures for Native students, and also in addition to creating the space, but creating opportunities where their voices can be heard and experiences can be shared?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll do is direct people to a resource that the College Fund has. It's a resource that gives recommendations for how campuses that from predominantly white institutions, PWIs, can create safe and welcoming environments. It was developed by the College Fund a couple of years ago with input from researchers, policymakers, presidents, and diversity and equity staff, students. Really looking at what are some of the ways that you can do that. That particular list of recommendations is available in a report on our website. I think it's a good thing for everybody to look at. It gives a real concise but very doable list of recommendations. The link is right there to the creating visible, safe and healthy learning environments. I think that's really a good resource. I think you should always ask questions about what's happening to Native students on your campus, what's happening to Native staff on your campus. My philosophy is if you have one Native student, you should know what's happening with that one Native student. I think that you should also be looking at the curriculum that you're teaching and the curriculum that others in your institution are teaching as to whether or not it's inclusive of Indigenous people's voices, our history, our contemporary lives, because we're not in the past, we're here today, and being able to include that. And as you know, my other colleagues would also point out, I think that we are broadly engaged in our communities. And I think higher education needs to be more integrated into community and finding ways to be supportive of the priorities and the opportunities in communities. I think all higher education institutions should be doing that. There are some great examples out there of institutions that are working to restore tribal languages, working on land-related projects, looking at giving land back, all kinds of things like that that are examples that people in higher education can take advantage of. We also have a really great research repository on the College Fund website. If you go to the College Fund website, that research repository for academics has a ton of information. We publish the only peer-reviewed research journal for tribal college and university faculty. So we're always happy to have people take a look at that. And our team members, you know, are always doing, that's how I met JD, was our team members are always working on building research visibility as well in Indian country. So you'll see a lot of that in our work as well. And there's the link right there to our research repository. So academics can go there. It's a great place to start.
And Jasmine, from your perspective, just kind of following up on some of the things that Dr. Crazy Bull shared, what, you know, from your experiences, what would some of that look like on mainstream campuses, just from your experience? If some of those things were there, what would it look like, or what would you like to see?
So I think one big thing that I thought of while Dr. Crazy Bull was talking about, and something that I'm thinking about a lot as I'm in the process of applying to law schools, if I don't see other Native people there, I'm going to assume that that's a place that Native people collectively have chosen not to be or didn't feel safe being at. So I would say, like, the number one greatest thing that mainstream institutions can do to make sure that we feel more visible, we feel safe, just make us more visible. Like, why are there whole institutions that have, you know, massive amounts of staff and not a single Native American person that's working there and that is happy? I straight up won't look at a law school if I don't see a Native person on their staff somewhere, especially on their faculty. I know Indigenous people who are graduating every day from doctoral programs and master's programs and all this. Like, there's not that many of us, but we're doing a lot of work. And so at this point, I think if there isn't an Indigenous person somewhere there, it's suspect to say the least. And then as far as attracting more students, like aside from the fact that having people who look like us would go a long way towards making us feel safe and included, understanding the historical inequities that have kept us out of mainstream institutions, the incredible scholarship support that American Indian College Fund provides for so many students is literally like the reason why some of us can be in school. I wouldn't be preparing to graduate were it not for American Indian College Fund. And that's definitely something that mainstream institutions can go a long way towards supplementing. You know, it sounds like a cliche to say just throw money at the problem, but like in certain situations, like, yes, money actually is something that will go a long way towards fixing this particular problem. In a way that's, you know, non-tokenizing, actually supportive, in all ways that the American Indian College Fund would be a great resource for any institutions who want to avoid those particular missteps. So I would say that would be my big thing. Like, if you want Native people there, you have to make sure there are Native people there. And yeah, that's my answer.
And then from a research perspective, Jameson, you talked a little bit earlier about like not asking the right questions and focusing on the community and what our outcomes, what outcomes could look like if the right questions were asked. And so for our folks who deal with data, or for the institutional research professionals, in your opinion, how can we tap into or get those Indigenous research methodologies included into the work? How could we think more intentionally and strategically about that and incorporate that into the data sets that we see on a regular basis?
Yeah, I think for me, it's like going back to the community and asking questions. You know, we were doing some GIS mapping, looking at census data with the American Community Survey, and they map out tribal homelands. And there was some 600 and some odd tribal homelands that we saw in that data set that were kind of across the United States. And one of my friends who was, I'm gonna forget his community right now, but he like raised his hand. And he goes, "I don't see my tribe in there." And I was like, "What?" Like, you know, and I'm like, it was like a band of Cherokee. And he goes, "We're separate. We're our own sovereign nation." But I was like, "Oh, I'm guessing it was probably lumped in within the geographic area of Cherokee." And so, but having people being able to comment on your research of saying like, "Hey," because even me as an Indigenous person, I don't know everything about every tribe within the United States. And, you know, I predominantly work with only my own tribe, but having reflective individuals who do understand communities and having as many, you know, eyes on the document that can have it, it really does help offer a different perspective on what you may be missing or not missing within the data. As far as Indigenous methodologies, you know, I always go back to my community. My community grounds me. So, you know, I have to stand before my council, and before I collect any kind of data within my community, I have to ask them for permission. And usually they're like, "Well, who the hell cares about this?" You know, they're like very blunt with me, and that's the way my tribal community works. And, you know, when they look at me and I like have to come up with an idea of like, okay, this is beneficial for the people. It's not just going to be a paper that I could write in a peer reviewed journal or a policy brief that, you know, no policies will be made from. It's actually going to be beneficial for my community in some way. And so I always end up going back to the tribe, and, you know, I work with our elders. And, you know, even when it came to something like educational outcomes, I said, you know, to our culture committee, which is our elders, just saying like, "Hey, you know, like, how to you, what is a successful college student?" Just letting them hear the words. And that's when I realized none of them said persistence, none of them said GPA, none of them said graduation rates. They said it's about protecting the land, it's about giving back, it's about keeping what is ours and what has always been ours. And when I think about that, I'm like, well, that's really implementing Indigenous, you know, quantitative methodologies in my mind, is you're basing it all on the community values, and that's where it should start. I would say there's the opportunity to take it just a step farther for those that are ready for that type of research, but basing it in Indigenous knowledge systems. You know, we call it giving back, you know, in this throughout this panel, we called it nation building. But in reality, if we were to look at that from an Indigenous word in my community, we call that Kwaname. And Kwaname is the embodiment of the warrior spirit. And in my mind, it's like, well, we're starting to measure giving back, but before, maybe we should jump another step ahead and say, maybe we should be measuring Kwaname, which Kwaname is the warrior spirit, this idea, it's gender non-binary, it's trans, it transcends everything that what's we may seem in mainstream society. And it's like something that's purely Quetzal. And many communities have this, but that word is ours, And I was like, maybe we should be measuring that, because when we speak to our elders, we speak to them, they're like, it's about protecting our land. We don't slug it out in the streets like we used to, but now we're fighting in the courts over water rights. We're fighting in the courts over land rights, agricultural rights. We're fighting over our gaming rights, where there's all these constant fights. We're fighting for our children through ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act. And so it's like, that's Kwaname, when we're fighting for the people. And I'm like, man, maybe that's what they want. I was like, that's the educational outcome we should be measuring. Let's measure that. I started doing some scale development, instrument survey scale development, and I created a documentary. It's called Kwaname, Protectors of the Quetzal. It's just a 10-minute thing. And it's the beginning initial findings from that research, but it's to inform how we might measure that in the future. So if any of you are interested, it's on Vimeo, but it's just a short way and an example of how we might be able to incorporate Indigenous methodologies into the actual research. And that way it can be helpful for not just community, but sustaining some of those traditional knowledge systems too that are already existing. So.
Thank you. Oh man, so rich. And like I said, just a little under 55 minutes ago, that we would get to the end of this and there wouldn't be any closure, right? There's just more thoughts, more thinking, more questions, but there has been additional information given to be more involved and to get more educated. And as we're coming to an end, I just wanted to give everybody just 30 seconds or less just for one final thought. And we'll start with Dr. Crazy Bull, go to Jameson, and end with Jasmine.
Yeah, I just want to honor the tribal colleges and the universities that are really doing the work that you heard. It's place work, it's community, family, traditional work. And then I want to share a story real quickly that was shared with me. I know that my other panelists won't mind. I worked with Tom Sampson from the Sarlip Nation out in Canada when I lived up in the Northwest, and he often told a story about how important it was for us as Indigenous peoples to be really rooted and grounded in our identity and our way of knowing, and that we should develop the ability to go over there into the white man's world, cross that bridge and go over there into their world and do the work that we needed to do so that we had a place to come back to. And so I just wanted to end by sharing that, because I think that that helps people understand what we as Indigenous people want to be like in today's world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jameson.
I just want to reiterate, thank you for having me. And, if anything, if you're in this world, try to learn something about Native people, anything you do know about Native people that's negative, question it, go find some research, study it, find some empirical evidence, challenge what you may have thought about Native people and just thinking like, well, is this really true, And I think that would go a long way in just making Indigenous people more visible within the US. So thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Sure. First off, thank you for having me here and for listening and allowing me to share with you all. I think one of the most important things to remember is about Indigenous students in particular is that we are working in a system that was designed to destroy us. I mean that culturally, I mean that literally, I mean every possible way. We all know, especially now, about the history of education in this country. The magical part, I think, the part that should really invigorate all of us is that despite all of that, we've managed to instead find a way to use it to empower ourselves, to empower our relatives and our communities, and make sure that we're using that to protect and fight for the things that we love. unfortunately, the world doesn't just stop if we stop playing. And so we are essentially trying to work in an imperfect system to be the people that we've always been, to be a good ancestor, which looks a lot different than it used to. The further we go with that, I think it's going to be beneficial for everybody. That's my hope, and that's what I'm going to keep working for. And I hope that everyone on this call is ready to join in that work with us. So thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing the space. And if I could sum this up in one sentence before turning this back over to Carol, is that, you know, the narrative and culture beats strategy every day of the week. And so it's so important to embrace culture and understand people's lived experiences and narratives so we can ensure that everybody thrives. And so again, thank you guys for tuning in this month to this edition of Get Comfortable Being Uncomfortable. Special thank you to all of our guests, and special thank you to Global Minded for continuing to provide this platform for us to have this type of development and these types of conversations. So love to you all. And thank you again for being here. Carol.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And I want to thank each of you for joining us and all of you who participated in this. And I think what it shows is when we're live in Denver in June 22nd, 23rd, 24th, we probably on the 22nd need to have a pre-conference with the 90 people who were here who had a lot to say. And unfortunately, this format wasn't able to, in our time frame, take in the questions, the input, the learnings that we have from the participants here today. So we'll look forward to getting more feedback from all of you as in the next month or two we plan that event in June. And Celeste will be sending everybody a link to the recording of the session today so you can share it out widely through your different networks. If you're at a predominantly white institution, hopefully people will have time and interest to learn about how it can be better for Native American students that they might have at their institution so that they're seen, their voice is heard, they're with the college president, their input is valued. So we'll be doing that. And then we also put a link in that Cheryl Crazy Bull was one of the awardees for the Inclusive Leader Awards this year, which we were really thrilled. And we'll put a link to that, as well as some of our newsletter articles of this month honoring Native American leaders that, again, any of your students, whether they're allies, whatever their backgrounds are, they can learn more about everyone when they're reading that newsletter every day. So we want to encourage all of you, the newsletter is free, to participate in that, and that our circle, this is our sacred circle, can be as wide as the world, and that it's not limited, and that there aren't people left out of that sacred circle. So thanks to all of you. I love and honor your traditions, your culture. I feel like I learned so much, and my life is so enriched because of what I know from each of you and those I've met on my personal journey. So, and Ryan, thanks again for always having such cutting edge and provocative sessions and guests. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Mhm.